Well, hello, lovers of freedom. Welcome back to the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be back with y'all this Saturday evening here on the Internet. I thought what I would talk to you tonight is about the meaning of freedom. You know, what does it mean to be free? And especially in the sense of economic liberty, the role of government in a free society, what does a free society look like? And of course, how we libertarians differ from statists, liberals and conservatives, with respect to what, free markets are all about, and freedom's all about, and economic liberty's all about. Because I think that's part of the big problem facing us in this country, is that people don't really have a strong sense of reality, of what it means to be free, of what a truly free enterprise, free market system is. And part of the reason for this is this statist concept of what freedom means. Let's start first with the Declaration of Independence. This is one of our founding documents for this country. It's what the Tea Party folks are talking about. It's what we libertarians have been talking about for many, many years. And the critical phrase in the Declaration, of course, deals with fundamental rights. Jefferson writes that all people have been endowed with certain fundamental, God-given, inherent natural rights. These rights pre-exist government, and they include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they're inherent to all people. They're not just American rights. They're inherent in the human being. That people have a right to pursue happiness. And what does that mean? Well, that means you pursue happiness in any way you choose. I mean, that's what we libertarians hold. That you can pursue happiness by engaging in any activity whatsoever. Even if it's self-destructive, even if it's dangerous, even if it's harmful, even if it's selfish. That this is what freedom is all about. This is what liberty is all about. It's the right to pursue happiness each in his own way, as long as, of course, he doesn't infringe on the right of other people to do the same thing. So you can't murder, and you can't rape, and you can't steal, and burglarize, and trespass, and commit fraud, and you can't infringe on the rights of other people who are simply pursuing happiness in their own way. So, what do we have government for? Well, Jefferson points out that we institute government to protect the exercise of these fundamental rights. For example, from the murderers, the rapists, the invaders, and when these people, the criminal band in society, commits these acts of violence against others, we expect the government to prosecute these people, grant them due process, grant them civil liberties, but go after them and punish them. And so that's the purpose of government. All right, well then let's move forward to the Constitution, because it's always good when we talk about the founding documents to talk about the Constitution in relationship to the Declaration, and the Declaration in relationship to the Constitution. The Constitution, of course, was the vehicle by which people of the United States called into existence the government, the federal government. Now, what was interesting about this calling this government into existence was that the American people had an option. They could have said, look, we really trust government. This is going to be a government composed of democratically elected officials, representatives, senators. These are people we can trust. They're going to be coming out of our neighborhoods. They're our friends. We're going to be sending them to Washington. We're going to have them have the power to do whatever they want in the best interest of society. And that's all they needed to do. I mean, they could have just, with the Constitution, said, we hereby call into existence the federal government, and it can do whatever it deems necessary for the best interest of the people, for the general welfare of the people. Well, that's not what they did. Okay, now why didn't they do that? Well, because our American ancestors didn't trust government. I mean, they knew what had gone on in history, that government, which is the organized means of coercion and compulsion, as Ludwig von Mises called it, that this organized means of coercion and compulsion would inevitably be used to oppress the citizenry, to take away these fundamental rights. And so if you gave a government unlimited powers, no restrictions on powers, there was no doubt where this was going to end up. That a government that had the power to do things in the best interest of the citizenry for the general welfare of the citizenry would be a government that would result in a tyrannical situation. That was not what they wanted. Obviously, they had just rebelled against their own government, some years before, 12 years before or so. They had taken up arms against their own government for infringing upon their individual rights, their fundamental rights. And so they certainly didn't want to bring into existence that type of government. So what did they do? They said, okay, well, this will be a government of limited powers. Now, this shocked the world. I mean, the world had been shocked with Jefferson's enunciation that rights don't come from government. Now, all of a sudden, here is the American people again shocking the world, saying, we're calling into existence a government, but whose powers are limited. People didn't know about limited powers, I mean, it's like, hey, wait a minute, the king has omnipotent powers. We live under dictators and so forth. What are those Americans doing? Well, they said, here is the charter for this government. It's going to be, here is the government, but here are its powers. And so that's what the enumerated powers doctrine was all about. And the idea was that, hey, if the power is not enumerated, you can't exercise it. So the government's called into existence, but, over the objection of lots of Americans, they just didn't trust this thing. They knew that government attracts people that lust for power, that even in the best interest, they have this zeal that I want to help the people, and they become little dictocrats, little dictators, even though they're democratically elected. And so the American people said, look, we're not going to take any chances here. We want to make sure that our fundamental rights are not going to be infringed upon. And there were those that said, no, that's not necessary. If there's no power here to interfere, for example, with freedom of speech or freedom of religion, you don't need to worry. They can't exercise it. Well, the Americans said, no deal. You want this government, we'll let you call it into existence, but only if you agree to enact a Bill of Prohibitions. I mean, it's called a Bill of Rights, but it's really not a Bill of Rights. It's a Bill of Prohibitions. It prohibits the government from interfering with rights, and specifically in the First and Second Amendment. Now, we'll talk about the civil liberties aspects of the Bill of Rights, the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments, at a later date. But right now, let's just stick with the fundamental God-given inherent natural rights. The right to speak and to read whatever you want and to publish whatever you want, to criticize the government without being scared that you're going to be thrown into jail, which governments have done throughout history. Governments don't like critics. And so the American people said, we want to make sure that these rights are enunciated. The right to keep and bear arms is another example. I mean, Americans understood that the way you keep a government in check is the right of the citizenry to bear arms. I mean, this is the ultimate insurance policy against a tyrannical government, the right to revolt, to defend yourself against these little tyrants. And so this was the system that came into existence. Now, the Ninth Amendment, of course, says, hey, look, this isn't an all-encompassing list of rights here. We've got the Ninth Amendment that says that just because we're enumerating certain rights, don't get the impression that this is all there is. So that was the system. Now, people might say, well, Jacob, what about democracy and all this? Where does democracy fit in? Well, if you look at the Constitution and you do a word search in there, you will search in vain for the word democracy. Why? Because the framers and our ancestors, the founding fathers, they all recoiled against democracy. I mean, they were fearful of democracy. They didn't believe in majority rule in the sense of fundamental rights. I mean, that's what they were afraid of, that the majority would be used to oppress the minority. And so they understood that you can have a dictatorial regime that's democratically elected. And this is this is kind of interesting, because this is what distinguishes libertarians from the statists, liberals and conservatives. Because many times liberals and conservatives equate democracy with freedom. You know, like for example, when the U.S. government invaded Iraq, a country that had never attacked the United States, the notion was, after of course the WMDs didn't show up, they morphed into a new mission, and that was democracy spreading. Oh well, while we're here, okay, we didn't find WMDs, but we're really here to spread democracy. Well, even to this day, you know, liberals and conservatives will say the Iraqi people are free, the Iraqi people are free. And why do they say that? Well, they say it for two reasons. One is because democracy. You know, so never mind that the Shiites, that were the majority, are now oppressing the Sunnis. I mean, in the liberal conservative mind, that's freedom, because it's democracy. You see, and then the second thing is, because this was a U.S. installed regime, or installed complements of the invasion and the occupation, that liberals and conservatives consider the Iraqi people free. And we'll talk about that later. But you see, the idea that they use is that democracy is freedom. The Iraqi people are free because democracy has arrived. Their people can have little purple ink on their fingers when they go vote and all this. Oh, wow, the Iraqi people are free. And that's the notion. Well, you know, libertarians say no. That democracy can be a tremendous threat to freedom because of the power of the majority to oppress the minority. You know, to give you a good example of this, suppose we had a government of general powers, you know, just a government that could enact any law it wanted for the welfare of the citizenry. So you got, let's say, 90% of the citizenry says, you know, I think it's a good idea that people go to church. And so we're going to pass law. Doesn't matter which church you go to. You can pick whatever church you go to. Protestant, you know, Catholic, Jewish synagogue, Muslim, as long as you go to church, even a non-denominational church, but you got to go to church. 90% of the American people say that. Public opinion polls confirm it, and so the members of Congress and the president, they enact a law that says everybody goes to church. Well, you see, a statist would say, hey, that's freedom. If you don't like it, get your people in office. But the libertarian would say no, that there are certain fundamental rights with which the majority cannot interfere. It doesn't matter if it's democratically elected. It's still wrong. It's illegitimate, because rights are inherent, rights are fundamental, they belong to the individual. Let me give you another example of this. I mean, the Nazi regime was democratically elected. Hitler was appointed through a chancellor of Germany through the democratic process. Does that mean that the Germans were free under the Nazis? Well, of course not. Another example, Venezuela. I mean, you know, Venezuela, as we all know, is a liberal's dream. I mean, you know, Hugo Chavez is elected, and he's established a socialist system. Now, the liberal would say, oh, well, see, there's freedom, and they would say there's freedom on two counts. One is that, hey, there's democracy there, and two is, hey, socialism is freedom, you know, which we'll talk about in a minute. The conservative would say, well, no, you know, the Venezuelans are not free despite the democratic elections, because their regime is not part of the U.S. empire, and that's how they would define freedom. You know, take another example of that. You know, when the CIA went into Iran and ousted the democratically elected prime minister of the country, Mohammad Mossadegh. I mean, this guy was a very popular, revered guy in Iran. He was the prime minister. He had been selected as Time Magazine's Man of the Year. I mean, that was how prominent he was in world affairs. Well, he nationalized Iranian oil. You know, not much different from what I talked about last week about Roosevelt's nationalization of gold among the American people. It's wrong, but, you know, this guy was taking essentially the same attitude as Roosevelt, you know, that the oil belongs to the government, to the people, to society, and he took it away from the British. You know, the British Empire had all the oil concessions, and the British were furious over this. Well, you know, they were going to instigate a coup to get their oil back, and But Mossadegh got wind of it, so he kicked all the British spies and the diplomats out of the country. So they couldn't pull off, the empire couldn't pull off the coup. So they got the CIA to do it, and the CIA goes to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower gives the okay, and so the CIA goes and ousts a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. They oust him from office. And, they instigate street protests. It was all a fake deal. It was really a fascinating deal. And they install into power, or reinstall, the Shah of Iran, who was a brutal man. I mean, you talk about tyrants and dictators. I mean, the guy never stood for election. And you talk about torturing his own people. Man, this guy was your torturer par excellence. And, of course, the secret police that he had to torture his own people was called Savak, and it was trained and supported by the CIA. That, of course, wouldn't surprise anyone. But throughout the Shah's dictatorial regime, the conservative status kept maintaining that the Iranian people are now free. They're free because the Shah's our friend. The Shah's a member of the empire, of the U.S. empire. And so that was how they were defining freedom. You see it in Latin America as well. The CIA ousted the democratically elected president of Guatemala, a man named Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was nationalizing some land that belonged to the United Fruit Company, major corporation, American corporation with close ties to people in Congress and people in the federal government. And that didn't sit well with them, and rightfully so. I mean, it was their land, but Arbenz was very much socialistic in the sense of Roosevelt was socialistic, Franklin Roosevelt. And so he's taking over some of the land, he's giving it to the poor. I mean, it's your classic, liberal socialist dream, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. And so the CIA goes in there at the behest of the United Fruit Company, and ousts Arbenz from power. I mean, it was a very clever little thing they did, but it was a coup, and they put in a military general. And of course, their idea was, hey, this is freedom now. This is freedom, because one of our people, a military general, even though he's unelected, is now in office. So, America's interests are being protected here. Never mind that the whole thing, set off a civil war that ended up costing, about 200,000 lives of the Guatemalan people. But what I'm trying to get you to understand is that democracy is not freedom. Okay, freedom is when you've got limits on the power of government, whether that government is dictatorially elected or appointed or democratically elected. Okay, well, what's the benefit of a democratic system? Well, Ludwig von Mises pointed out there's really just one benefit, and that is that it enables people to peacefully change regimes, to change administrations, to change people in office. Ideas change, people get disgusted with certain politicians. An election gives the people the opportunity to do that peacefully. If you don't have that peaceful means of ousting people from office or changing paradigms, then the only possibility is revolt. I mean, revolution, to oust those people from power and to put in a new power. So that's really the only real advantage. But democracy, it can help people to shift peacefully to a new administration, to a new regime, but it is not freedom. Now, let's look at the type of economic system that came into existence as a result of these ideas. You've got Jefferson's ideas, and you've got then you've got the Constitution of enumerated powers, limited powers. Well, we know that it was a bad system in certain respects. The biggest respect, of course, is slavery. I mean, everybody knows, and they knew it, that it was that you couldn't find a better violation of freedom than to enslave human beings. I mean, there you have your direct violation of pursuing happiness, of liberty, of life, and so forth. Then you've got tariffs during this time, protective tariffs that were causing consumers to pay more money for goods than they ordinarily would. And why shouldn't a person be able to buy whatever he wants from whomever is selling it? Whether it's the British or whether it's the French or whoever it is. But these tariffs were put on there to protect local industries, and of course they're just a tax. They're like a sales tax. They would tax, and the money goes, of course, to the government. So those are two big violations of the principles of freedom. You had many minor violations, including at the state and local level. But what people cannot deny, nobody can deny this, the most ardent statist, liberal or conservative, cannot deny that this was a society that, for the really first time in history, large numbers of people, most of the populace, lived without any taxation on income. That is to say that you could keep everything you earned. I mean, imagine that. Imagine getting your paycheck and looking at it and not seeing any deduction for income tax, FICA, Medicare, no deductions at all. That you get a check for $1,000, it's $1,000 if that's what you're owed, that your employer's paid you. Think about how much you've paid in income taxes for the past 10 years. I mean, let's just say it's $10,000 a year. That would mean you'd have $100,000 extra dollars in your bank account right now. I mean, it is impossible to overstate the significance of this way of life. And it didn't just happen momentarily. It wasn't just a couple of years. This is how Americans lived for more than 100 years. Imagine that. More than a century, Americans lived without any taxation on their income. No IRS, no keeping the little receipts and having to prove your deductions and home mortgage deduction and your interest deduction and all that stuff. None of that. No IRAs, no 401ks. You kept it all. You decided what to do with it. You wanted to save 50% of it, you did. You wanted to go out and consume it, you go to the mall of that time and shop and spend it all. That was up to you. But it was an incredible period. Now, not only that, there was also, imagine, no Social Security. So that Social Security deduction on your paycheck, it wasn't there. Because there was no Social Security. There was no Medicare, no Medicaid, no welfare. I mean, there was actually no systems of public government schooling, no food stamps, no foreign aid, no bank bailouts. In other words, no welfare. It was incredible. And this also went on for more than 100 years. So imagine that, a way of life. I mean, it's impossible to overstate how unique this was, how different it was from all of history. No taxation on income. You made it, you kept it. Virtually no economic regulations. I mean, you wanted to open a business, you just opened up a business. You didn't get a license or a permit. I'm talking about lawyers and doctors. And you let the consumers decide. And then you keep the fruits of your earnings. You could enter into trades with other people, mutually beneficial exchanges. You can make money. I mean, you know what the significance of this from the economic standpoint is, and this drives the liberals batty, is that this was the first time in history where the poor actually had a chance to get wealthy. You see, they decry the Industrial Revolution. They say, oh, it's horrible, it's horrible, it's horrible. Well, horrible compared to what? Compared to what was going on in all the other countries and what had gone on in history, where people would die of starvation and famine and disease and cholera and the plague and so forth. Here, for the first time, people had a chance to survive. People weren't sending their children into the factories and their wife into the factory because they hated them, as the statists suggest. They were sending them in the factory because this was a chance to have them survive. I mean, people had nothing. And so here was a chance. Hey, we got something. The kids are having to work, but we got a chance to survive, and people did survive. And after about 2 or 3 generations, people realized they were saving money. That money was going into the banks. That money became the capital that businesses were borrowing to go out and get better equipment, better tools. And guess what? That's where the people were, the ones that were putting their savings away in the bank. They were working in those businesses. So all of a sudden they find themselves coming to work with fancier equipment, fancier tools. they're able to produce more. And guess what happens when they produce more? The company becomes more profitable. That means higher wages for the workers. And you say, okay, well, what's to guarantee that? What was guaranteeing it? Well, the fact that there was a lot of other businesses opening up, workers would check around and they'd say, hey, what is they paying over there? What are they paying over there? And through the process of competition, if a guy wanted to keep his better workers, he'd have to pay him more money. So it was a remarkable period. I mean, it was a very, very prosperous period. Oh, and by the way, only the most charitable nation in history. I mean, this is how, when people were free to accumulate wealth, this is how they built the museums, the opera houses, the hospitals, the universities, the museums. I mean, when people were free to accumulate wealth, they gave a large portion of it away. No, not because of an income tax deduction, just because they wanted to. They felt like, hey, this is the right thing to do. But even those that didn't would plow it back into capital, which would then make workers more productive, and on and on. I mean, what this system was showing was that, contrary to what Marx says and what the statists say today, there is not this natural conflict between the employer and the employee, worker and business, the wealthy and the poor, that there is in fact a harmony of interests. And this is what Frederick Bastiat started saying, in the mid-1800s, that there's this harmonization in a free market, free enterprise system. Now, we can't really say they designed the system. I mean, it's really sort of the byproduct. I mean, they had read, the framers had read Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. All right, Smith was there saying that, hey, if you want to know why some nations are wealthy and other nations are poor, here's the reason. Because in those nations where, enterprise is freer, or free in an absolute sense, you're going to have higher standards of living. I mean, we see that today. Like with, let's say, North Korea, which is a totally socialist country. Government owns everything. Everybody works for the state. They're on starvation. They're on the starvation level. Everybody's starving to death. They have to get their foreign aid. I think China provides like 90% of their aid. And the same thing was with China, but notice how China's been liberalizing its economy, lessening up on the controls, letting up on the taxation, and all of a sudden you see a lot of economic prosperity there. This is essentially what Smith was saying. So the framers had this in mind when they called this government into existence, when there wasn't an income tax, welfare redistribution, and so forth. But, let's face it. I mean, they were looking through a glass darkly. They didn't have the benefit yet of Bastiat or the other classical economists, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill. I mean, these people would come about in the 1800s. And then, of course, they didn't have the benefit of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and the Austrian school. I mean, that would come much later, in the late 1800s, 1900s. But notice that the system they brought into existence is remarkable in terms of what we call economic liberty. No income tax, no welfare, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid. Oh, by the way, no immigration controls. Yeah, in other words, anybody could just come. I mean, they were on their own. It was root, hog, or die, as they put it back then. You were on your own. Government's not here going to bail you out. And guess what? I mean, thousands of penniless immigrants, many of whom could not even speak English, were flooding American shores every day just for the chance to survive and become wealthy. They had heard the stories. And sure enough, they dive in and they start contributing to the prosperity of the country. Now, as people say, oh, well, Jacob, they check for disease. Yeah, okay. They would look to see if you had tuberculosis. But other than that, I mean, how many people have tuberculosis? A small, tiny minority. They were flooding in. They were fleeing the land of statism, of government control, government regulation, government taxation, to come to the land where there was no taxation on income. Enterprise was free of government control, and no socialistic welfare state programs. Now, notice that something changed, though. and that, of course, the big revolution. Remember last week I was talking about that, that they also had sound money. They had the gold standard that was also contributing to the tremendous prosperity. But the big watershed era came in the Roosevelt administration. Now, you had the Income Tax Amendment in 1913. You got the Federal Reserve come in 1913. A monumental year for statism. And through the late 1800s and early 1900s, that's where the socialist ideas were starting to percolate here in the United States. The progressives, you've heard of the progressives, they were just socialists. I mean, that's what they were. They had gone to Europe. They had studied what the socialists were teaching out of Europe. Marx had now published his works, and they were bringing back these ideas. And so there was a tremendous ideological battle that was taking place late 1800s, early 1900s. It was playing out in all realms, including in the Supreme Court, where you had the battle taking place between the economic libertarians and the statists. But the watershed era came in the Roosevelt era. The Roosevelt used the Great Depression, which a crisis had been established by the Federal Reserve, and he used that crisis to totally upend American life. I mean, that was the welfare state revolution. Now, of course, the income tax had already come into existence. There was already an IRS. But now here was the system that Roosevelt said, this is what we're going to use the money for. We have unlimited amounts of money. I mean, when they imposed the income tax and the IRS, I mean, they sold it on the basis that you hear today. Oh, we're going to do it only on the rich, only on the rich. It's only going to be 2 or 3%. Well, of course, that was nonsense. They were always going to tax the middle class and, of course, the poor, because they're voracious. I mean, the government spending is voracious. So here comes Roosevelt and says, well, we're going to establish a social security system. He got the idea from Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, if you can believe that. That's why Bismarck's bust is on the Social Security Administration's website, if you can believe that one also. I mean, it's incredible. They don't have Madison or Franklin or Washington. They got Otto von Bismarck's bust on the website of the Social Security Administration, the American Social Security Administration. And Bismarck, of course, had gotten the idea from the German socialists at the turn of the century. Well, Roosevelt brings it over here, and he forces it on the American people, and then this is where you get the managed economy, the regulated economy, the Securities Exchange Commission. He was trying to cartelize the entire American system. I mean, like put industries into cartels, like the automobile industry in a cartel and the steel industry in a cartel. This is what Roosevelt was trying to do. And, it was fortunate that the Supreme Court declared that one unconstitutional. And they were declaring much of what he was doing as unconstitutional. It was alien. I mean, it was a combination of, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, which is National Socialism. In fact, I mentioned before, a great book to read is 3 New Deals by a guy named Schivelbusch that shows the similarities between Roosevelt's, Hitler's, and Mussolini's system. So it was a newfangled system. It was a total paradigm shift. And then, of course, after that, you got Medicare, Medicaid through the Johnson administration, who, of course, idolized Roosevelt. He was an icon for Johnson. And then the whole kit and caboodle, the foreign aid, the welfare, the community grants, the whole transfer society. Well, now, that gets us to the point. Now, what does it mean to be free? Well, notice that you've got 2 different systems here now. You've got a system where you've got people managing their own retirement, their own health care, their own income, and then you've got an opposite system here. And so, which one is free? How can they both be free? Well, status, on 4th of July, they'll celebrate, oh, we're free, we're free, we're free. But they don't really confront the reality of what they're talking about. Because you see, the reality of a liberal and a conservative, for him, that America has a free enterprise system. I mean, they're convinced that America's free enterprise. And this is ingrained in most Americans. I mean, we libertarians, what distinguishes us is we have broken free of the indoctrination. We've broken free of the propaganda. We have a grip on reality. These people, the statists, believe that free enterprise is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare. In other words, this whole system where government's taking care of people they're proud of as America's free enterprise system. And it's ingrained in kids from the first grade on up. America is free. America has a free enterprise system. I mean, look at the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, everybody's required to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in those government schools every morning, you know, with liberty and justice for all. In other words, you live in a country and where you're free. You know, never mind that the Pledge of Allegiance was crafted by a socialist. You're not going to hear that in a public school. But Google it if you got any doubts about what I'm telling you. Google Pledge of Allegiance Socialist, and you'll see that it was crafted by a self-avowed socialist named Bellamy. But you see, this is their mindset, that America's free, America's free, America's exceptional, it's free, it's free, it's free. Because in their mind, this is all free enterprise. And this is what Roosevelt did. This is what the statists had to do. Remember I told you last week when Roosevelt nationalized gold and he made it a felony offense to own what had been the official money of the United States for more than 100 years? That his purpose was to smash out of the collective consciousness of the American people that this concept of gold is money. And they went 30 years or so once it was smashed out, and it has been smashed out except among libertarians. This notion that gold is the money, and that the Federal Reserve note is just a note that now promises to pay nothing. Well, they did the same thing with respect to the welfare state. They knew that the only way they could get away with this is to inculcate a mindset, tell Americans, this is not socialism. This is free enterprise. But Roosevelt is simply modifying our free enterprise system to save it. And that's the thing that's taught in these government schools, in the government-approved schools, the private schools. You know, that's what's taught. That the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, saved free enterprise. Well, it's just nonsense. I mean, this was socialism par excellence. These were socialist programs. But that's their mindset. You see, for us, libertarians, freedom means the right to keep everything you earn. You decide what to do with it. Now, notice that when the thing starts to crack apart, which it is now, I mean, it's cracking apart like crazy. Social Security's busted. The FDIC's busted. There's another little socialist program. Medicare and Medicaid are busted. I mean, healthcare costs are soaring. Borrowing's out of control. The national debt. Bankruptcy looms on the horizon like it did in Greece, and like it's threatening to do in Ireland. I mean, this is your welfare state. This is what liberals and conservatives call freedom and free enterprise, where government is taking care of people. And we libertarians say, no, that's not what freedom's all about. And the sad, you know what the sad part about this is? They teach their children this. Because you see, their concept is that as long as the child believes something that's not true, that's not real, that's all that matters. That you can create your own reality. Well, that's just nonsense. I mean, any psychiatrist will tell you that if you operate under delusion, you're going to have adverse consequences because it's not real. You know, and that's what you want to know why, conservatives and liberals resent us libertarians? It's not just that we want to dismantle their beloved programs, Social Security, Medicare, the IRS, and so forth. That's not the only reason. That's one reason. But it's because we make them confront reality. We say your system is not freedom. Your system is not free enterprise. Your system is statism. And they hate that. They hate that because they know the young people are listening to us. And they have this concept that if they can just keep teaching young people the lie, the delusion, that everything will be okay. Well, that's just wrong. And you know what? That's why a lot of young people are joining up with the libertarians. I mean, that's why you see this dynamism taking place in the libertarian movement. Because kids, children, minors, young adults, they're figuring out what we libertarians have figured out. They're breaking through. And they're seeing they've been lied to. They've been fed a mess of pottage. They've been fed delusions. And they're tired of it. I mean, they're tired of being lied to, and so we libertarians are saying, hey, this is not freedom and free enterprise. In fact, here's another example, is the drug war. I mean, you know, liberals and conservatives, when they say, oh, the troops are defending our freedoms, the troops are defending our freedoms, in their mind, it's not just the paternalistic state, it's also the drug war that you can put people into jail for ingesting a harmful substance. I mean, it's incredible. Why is that any business of the state, what a person ingests? I mean, why shouldn't a person be free to pursue happiness in his own way? But this is freedom. This is what you know, liberals and conservatives inculcate in the minds of the young in those government-approved schools. You live in a free country. It's exceptional. It's free enterprise. You know, and you know, I'm no psychiatrist, but you know, I see all these young people on drugs, and they you know, say, oh, all we got to do is have a campaign of just say no, just say no. This is such ridiculous nonsense. There's a reason why people are taking drugs. There's something going on inside of them that they have a need to medicate. And that could be, you know, family stuff that's taking place at home. It could be any number of things. But I tell you, I would love to see, you know how you always hear people calling for studies? Well, I'd like to see a private sector study on the effect of taking a kid out of his home by force through the state coercive apparatus of the public government schooling system. You know, I wonder how much that has effect on a person. I mean, it's got to. I mean, it just stands to reason. But also this sense of a delusion that you feed these kids of, this is a free society, it's free enterprise, the government's taking care of you, it's protecting you from the dangerous people like the drug dealers and the illegal aliens, and this is freedom, and this is freedom. Well, that's a delusion. It's not reality. It's not freedom. It's control, it's socialism, it's interventionism. And you know, maybe, you know, every time I see a young person that commits suicide, you know, when I read it in the papers, you know what thought enters my mind? The first thought that enters my mind is, you know, I wonder if that kid had known that this wasn't freedom, would that have made a difference? Because, you know, maybe he was so disgusted with life and said, well, you know, if this is a free system, which it is, because I've been taught it is, if this is the best there is, man, I'm checking out. I'm checking out with drugs, or I'm checking out of life. But you see, if you know that this is a socialistic system that produces poverty and despondency and depression and just bad results, bankruptcy and conflict and disharmony and envy and covetousness and taking what doesn't belong to you and stuff, I mean, you know, that's not a good system. That's a bad system. So let me move into the other sector of this thing, the role of government in a free society, because I mean that deals with economic liberty. But here's another big one. You know, notice that these statists, you know, before I leave that subject, the last thing they're going to do is touch these socialistic programs. You know, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Oh, they'll talk about reforming them and modifying them, and even privatizing them. You know, they're going to fix them. But they're committed to them. That's what distinguishes these people, the statists, from the libertarians. We want freedom. We want the responsibility, the ability to keep everything we earn. We decide our own retirement. We decide our own health care, not the government. We save our money. We decide how much we're going to spend and how much we're going to save, how much we're going to donate. We decide donations, not them. We decide caring and compassion and who to help and so forth, not them. That's what separates. That's the divide. It's a divide that is on reality. That, you know, what does it mean to be free? It's also a divide on what we want in this society in terms of achieving freedom. Because the first step is making them confront the reality. But many people may say, okay, it is statism, but we like it. I mean, that's what a lot of liberals will say. Before I go to the next subject, I want to tell you about an article today. It's really funny in the Washington Post by Colbert King. It's called "If Obama's a Socialist, What is Bush?" King goes into all the things that Bush did that were exactly like Obama. You know, the big spending, the socialist programs, TARP, the bailouts. This was all Bush stuff. And the conservatives, of course, were eating it up. And the point of the King makes is, hey, we're all socialists, you know, liberals and conservatives. And, of course, he doesn't mention libertarians because we're the only ones that are not. But at least he's got a grip on reality here that, hey, it's all socialism. Now, let me talk about the military, though, because this is where, look, we've all grown up we under the status system. We grew up under Social Security. Many people grew up under Medicare and Medicaid. We've grown up with this system, but we've also grown up with this enormous military, the military-industrial complex, the Department of Defense, you know, and so the statists believe that this is part of a free society. I mean, it never occurs to them that this is antithetical to a free society. In previous wars, the tradition had been you dismantle your military. I mean, you put everybody out in the private sector, no standing army. Go back and read what the framers and the founding fathers said about standing armies. I mean, that they were threats to freedom, that it was the worst thing you could have in your society, that ultimately the guns are going to be turned internally to enforce order. And they recoiled against standing armies. Dwight Eisenhower, who had a lot of experience with the military, he warned about this newfangled thing that was coming into existence at the end of World War II, what he called the military-industrial complex. In 1947, you get the National Security Act that brings into existence the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you know, the Pentagon, the CIA, an agency that would have unlimited powers. Now notice, the conservatives say, oh, we want limited government, we want limited government. But the CIA has unlimited power. It can do whatever it wants, assassinate, torture, with impunity, spy on Americans, it doesn't matter. Nobody's ever going to prosecute them. You know, when you have one agency of government that has unlimited powers, that is an unlimited government. You don't need all the agencies to have the unlimited power. One will do. But in any event, you know, here they had gotten into World War I, you know, the war to end all wars, the war, don't forget, to spread democracy, right? And they cost the lives of, I forget how many tens of thousands of American men for nothing. I mean, it was just absolutely nothing. But here was the start of this mindset of empire, of Globocop, that we're going to really settle things in Europe. They've been fighting in Europe for years and centuries, and man, we're going to come in here and we're going to show them how the cow eats the cabbage, and this will be the war to end all wars. Well, it was really just stage one of a two-stage war. U.S. intervention gave rise to the conditions that brought Hitler and the Nazis to power. You know, the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations, the whole shebang. And so all of a sudden you got World War II. And at this point, you know, at the end of that war, the statists say, oh, well, see, we brought freedom, we beat Hitler. Well, they forgot what the whole purpose of the war had been, and that was to free the Polish people from tyranny, Nazi tyranny. Well, at the end of the war, guess what? They were free from Nazi tyranny only to have to suffer under communist tyranny for the next 50-some-odd years, or 47 years, or whatever, all of Eastern Europe and East Germany. And this is still considered a big victory by statists. But then they go around, this is sort of the conflicted mindset of statists, they say, oh, but wait a minute, we have to have a Cold War against a partner, you know, in the hot war. And that, of course, was the national security state, the CIA partnership with Nazis that they had just gone to war against. They're now saying, hey, let's become partners to go against the new enemy. And this became the era of perpetual war and perpetual preparation for war and crises and national security. And, you know, they get involved in the Korean War. 50-some-odd thousand American men. That wasn't good enough. They get involved in Vietnam, you know, making up a lie at the Gulf of Tonkin. That cost 58,000 American men for nothing. You know, the dominoes didn't fall. The communists didn't come up through Mexico and conquer the United States. But the whole time, this enormous military, contractors, bases, I mean, it's incredible how it has become this enormous part of American life. And it's not just a drain economically. I mean, remember, these people are no different from welfare recipients. They live off the tax revenue. They live off the government largesse, all the contractors. But the insidious part of this thing is the sense of dependency on this junk. That, oh, America wouldn't survive without the big military, and oh my gosh. This is ridiculous. I mean, There's not any country, any nation state that's got even the remote capability of amassing the ships and the transport planes and the invasion forces to invade the United States. It just, hey, you think this government's broke, the federal government? Try every other government. Every government's broke. I mean, there's, you know what it would take to cross the oceans in a successful invasion of the United States? I mean, tens of thousands of ships, planes, troops, materiel, supply lines. It's a non-existent threat. So, when they had built up this huge monstrosity during the Cold War, the biggest shock was when the Soviet Union came apart, because like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? And remember people were talking about the peace dividend and stuff? Well, of course, the empire, and that's what it is, it's an empire, it goes abroad and starts poking hornets' nests all over the Middle East. And that's when you had the sanctions against the Iraqi people, and that was killing hundreds of thousands of their children. You had Madeleine Albright's infamous statement to the United Nations saying the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children are worth it. You had the unconditional military and financial aid to the Israeli government. You had the no-fly zones. I mean, they were just poking and poking and poking, and sure enough, they got retaliation. And at the Future of Freedom Foundation, we were saying this was going to happen before 9/11. And of course, they continue doing the same thing. They used 9/11 to invade Iraq and do what the sanctions had not accomplished. That was the real purpose of the invading Iraq. The WMDs was the excuse. The democracy spreading was the excuse. It was really all about a regime change, putting a favorable regime into power. Afghanistan, I mean, a huge disaster. I noticed that we just broke the record. We broke the Soviet Union's record. Isn't that great for occupying Afghanistan? I mean, and then, have you seen what they're doing in Korea? I mean, they're over there, shooting missiles right off in an island that's right off the coast of North Korea. I mean, what is up with these people? Do you know what would happen if Hugo Chavez, if he were to fire some missiles into the Gulf of Mexico? I mean, that man would not be long for this world. Bombs would be dropping on Caracas tomorrow, if not sooner. I mean, with that kind of provocation. Or you want to know, here's another example. Suppose China came over here with a fleet of carriers and ships and started doing exercises in the Gulf of Mexico. Or, better yet, in cooperation with Cuban officials, start doing it off Miami shores. I mean, can't you see the New York Times and the Washington Post saying, oh, China's becoming assertive, China's becoming aggressive, and there'd be, this massive crisis. Well, what are they doing over there? They're stirring up crises, and this is what the empire has done. This is what Madison warned that an empire would do. This is what had been done in the Roman Empire. That every time people start to rebel and revolt against the high taxes, the regulations, the oppression, like the Roman citizens did, the Roman Empire, the military out in the outlying areas and the Germanic areas would stir up an attack, and the barbarians are coming, and everybody would be expected to rally to the flag, rally to the government. We've got a crisis, we've got a new war, let's put your disputes aside. Well, this is what this military-industrial complex is doing to this country. It is this perpetual war, this perpetual fear, the body scanners at the airport, the spying on Americans on their emails, and the torture, the assassinating Americans. The root cause of this is what we've all grown up with. This huge standing army, this huge military. And what's bad about it is that when you grow up with it, you can't conceive of how nice life would be without it. It just seems like an integral part of life. It feels like, this is freedom, this is free enterprise. And that's where, again, the status delusionary concept of freedom comes in, because remember, you can't have opposites. Our ancestors lived without a standing army for more than 100 years, without a military-industrial complex. And look what they've done with the military bases. I mean, do you know that there's 700 to 1,000 military bases overseas? I mean, this is Globocop to the extreme. And they serve as a projection of force in the host country. if that host country doesn't vote the right way or something, hey, those troops are there for regime change if the need comes about, or a regime change operation somewhere else. One of the best things I heard in this respect was when the Ecuadorian president was kicking the U.S. base out of there, and they were threatening him, losing foreign aid and all stuff, which, by the way, is another way they get these foreign regimes part of the empire. They put them on the dole the same way they put Americans on the dole. The Ecuadorian president says, hey, look, you can keep your base here, but you'll have to give us a base in Miami. In other words, an Ecuadorian military base in Miami. Well, that didn't sit too well with the empire. The empire can go and put bases in overseas countries, but not the other way around. And then look here in the United States. I mean, everybody that's got a military base in their city, I mean, they have a conniption fit. It's created this sense of dependency that when anybody talks about, terminating the base, closing the base, everybody just freaks out. And you think the military doesn't know this? You think that when they were building these, 5,000-6,000 bases across the United States, they didn't know what it would do? I mean, if a congressman gets out of line with respect to some military bill, some new tank or plane or whatever, all they do is just threaten to close the base in his district. And it's, national security, and the congressman starts pleading, he gets on his knees and says, national security depends on the base, because all his constituents are saying, hey, jobs, and of course, you're talking about bars and the prostitutes and all the other stuff that conglomerates around military bases in America. I mean, this is what they've done. This is what the welfare warfare state has done. It's created a sense of dependency, this mindset of dependency. So how do we overcome this? I mean, how do we get people? Well, one thing is you got to get people to break through to what is a free society and what is the role of government in a free society. But the American people need to get this sense of what is real, what does it mean to be free. And hey, that's why they're studying the founding documents and they're studying, what happened here and so forth. That's what this talks about. But it goes deeper than that. It's not only understanding the socialism, the interventionism, the imperialism versus, liberty, free markets, a constitutional republic. We've got to believe in ourselves again. It's not just belief in yourself. You got to believe in other people. That the bureaucrats are not the only good and caring people in society. You got to believe that hey, not every country is out there getting ready to invade and attack the United States. That there's natural harmonies that can exist in the world through things like free trade and mutual interchange between people. That's not to say that bad things don't happen around the world. And if Americans get outraged and they don't like some tyranny overseas, let them go over there and fix it. But what our founding fathers said is, let's build a model society here of freedom. No standing army, no military-industrial complex, no welfare state, economic liberty, liberty in all respects. Hey, if people are suffering tyranny and oppression overseas, open the borders, let them come to America, let them escape the tyranny. They're on their own, they've got to make it on their own. This is what it means to be free. And so what we've got to do in this country, we've got to, debate the meaning of freedom in a free society. What does a free society look like? What is the role of government in a free society? But we've got to capture that sense of independence, of can-do, where we're not so scared of, oh my gosh, what if Social Security is repealed? Oh, everybody's going to be dying in the streets. Oh, what if there's no public schooling? Everybody's going to be stupid. And what if there's no drug laws? Everybody's going to be smoking dope. And I mean, that's the kind of sense, all these catastrophic fears we've got to conquer. We've got to believe in ourselves. We've got to believe in freedom. We've got to believe in free markets. And we got to believe in the power of voluntary charity. I mean, this is what free will is all about. It's a matter of having faith in yourself and a faith in others, a faith in God. And this is what a free society is. And our founding fathers were looking at that, looking at through a glass darkly. There was big exceptions, the slavery and the terrorists and many minor exceptions, but they pointed the way. It's our job to build on what they started, to build on that foundation, and restore, dismantle the welfare programs, repeal them, abolish them, dismantle the warfare state, dismantle the overseas bases, close the bases here, discharge the soldiers, abolish taxation on income, free the American people to pursue happiness each in his own way. Thank you very much. See you next week.